From rubble to riches, Marta Dan is a homemaker, literally. Starting out as a squatter on the Lower East Side, she's now living as a legal tenant in the same building.
We work hard to make it a home. It was a shell, it was dilapidated, it was neglected, and we came here and took care of it.
Uprising in Syria, more than 5,000 protesters killed. One survivor, now in Brooklyn, tells his story.
I
didn't feel anything, but suddenly I felt like my leg was paralyzed. I looked at my leg and saw it was bleeding a lot.
Provocative views on the prospect of a Palestinian state. 3 Israeli New Yorkers weigh in.
Without a peace agreement, there is no peace. There is no two countries.
What is a Prada store doing in the middle of the desert of West Texas? Stay tuned. I'm Jennifer Hamblett.
I'm Alva French.
I'm Rachel Jenishvili.
And I'm Judy Lee. We'll have these stories next on this month's edition of 219 West. First, finding a place to live. At year's end, the number of homeless New Yorkers was the highest since the Great Depression. Each year, more than 110,000 homeless New Yorkers sleep in the city's shelter system. Faced with those numbers, the Bloomberg administration proposed a controversial policy requiring people to prove that they qualify for admission into shelters. The search for an affordable place to call home is becoming more difficult than ever. Marta Dan has always lived on the Lower East Side. First as a squatter, and now as a tenant. For years, she lived rent-free without electricity and running water. For Dan, squatting is the answer to the search for affordable housing.
So you're gonna cook the rice over here.
Marta Dan literally built the walls of the kitchen she now cooks in.
When I got into my apartment, it looked like that. This is Marcelo's room going to the front of the building. That would be another door. But that front room, this room that you see where the windows are, that is belongs to the other apartment.
20 years ago, Dan was among a group of people who moved in as squatters and took possession of what was then an abandoned building on Avenue C. The roof leaked, and they needed to open umbrellas to stay dry inside. That's the reason the building is called the Umbrella Squat. Squatting is against the law.
Someone who snuck in or broke in or just moved in without any permission, either from the owner or from the tenant.
Dan was willing to put in years of hard work repairing the building than live on the streets or in a shelter. Within the past decade, the number of the homeless within the shelter system has almost doubled to more than 41,000.
Within the New York State Constitution, there is a right to a home. So one should not confuse the right to a home with the right to shelter.
Frank Morales works with New York-based group Organized for Occupation, or O4O. O4O champions safe and affordable housing as a basic human right. It does this by finding abandoned buildings, moving in, and making them more comfortable. When Kendall Jackman lost her job at the post office, she couldn't pay her rent. She jumped from couch to couch before she entered the shelter system 2 years ago.
Nobody needs to be homeless. Nobody needs to be living double and triple dog. Nobody needs to have a roommate. There's enough supply for the demand in this city that everybody can have a home and live comfortably.
Filing rate of foreclosures in parts of New York City surpassed the national rate in 2009. A little more than half of those remain empty. Jackman has joined the organization called Picture the Homeless, or PTH, a community of homeless people working together to end homelessness through changes in city policy.
HL 48 would mandate the city and change the city charter where they would have to do an annual census of all vacant property. From there, you would know exactly how much vacant property there is in the city and where it's located.
Picture the Homeless organized to count the vacant buildings in Manhattan. It found 24,000 buildings that could be turned into apartments, enough housing to shelter every single homeless person in the city. Jackman, a Brooklyn native, has remained in the shelter for 2 years. That's because of the lack of affordable housing, the #1 reason for homelessness. The city is looking into implementing tougher rules for admission into shelters. Proof of no other housing options would be required. Many homeless look for park benches, subway platforms, and bus stations for refuge. Others illegally squat in an empty building. Frank Morales has been squatting at the Lower East Side since the early 1980s.
The municipality spends $1 billion a year on the homeless industry. It would be a lot cheaper to renovate all the abandoned buildings and places and put people there.
There are more than 11 buildings occupied by squatters on the Lower East Side. They are home to more than 400 people.
I feel like, yeah, I deserve this place because I went through it. It was, we work hard to make it a home. It was a shell, it was dilapidated, it was neglected, and we came here and took care of it,
The umbrella squat was renovated with the help of the not-for-profit organization Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. In 2010, it became low-income apartments, and now Marta Dan is a legal tenant. For 219 West, Judy Lee, Manhattan.
How you doing? My name's Steve. My family's lived in this neighborhood for years. Recently, things got so tight, we had to go to our local food bank for help. I lost a lot of sleep worrying about what the neighbors might think. That is until I saw them there, too. How'd I do, Steve?
A little stiff. You could have done a little better.
What? Come on. I have an Academy Award.
Yeah, but not for playing me.
Play a role in ending hunger. Visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank.
Since the uprising in Syria began almost a year ago, more than 5,000 people have been killed. It's next to impossible to get first-hand reports about what's happening there. But one young man managed to escape to tell his story. In March of 2011, the Syrian people did the unthinkable. They took to the streets demanding an end to the reign of Bashar al-Assad, whose family has controlled the country for more than 40 years. 21-year-old Ahmed Sadawi was one of them.
People were chanting freedom and down with the regime and calling for them to stop the killing in all the cities in Syria.
But in Syria, dissent comes at a high price. The government's security forces unleashed a brutal crackdown, and unarmed protesters were met with a barrage of bullets. On the morning of Friday, April 15th, Ahmed left his home in Latakia to take part in his third protest. But this time his mother Zina, terrified he would be arrested by security forces, pleaded with him to stay. I said to him, "Sweetheart, just for this Friday, let it go. I have a terrible feeling that something's going to happen today. Let this one go, and next Friday I'll let you." He said, "No, Mama, I decided I'm going out." I said, "I'm not scared for you to die. I'm scared they will arrest you." He left me, so I started praying for him. As Ahmed and other demonstrators emerged from the mosques, troops opened fire on them. This cell phone video on the internet shows Ahmed moments before he was shot in the right hip.
I didn't feel anything, but suddenly I felt like my leg was paralyzed. I looked at my leg and saw it was bleeding a lot.
Fellow protesters carried him inside a building where they hid from security forces.
I had turned yellow and I was shaking continuously. All I wanted to do was sleep and rest, but nobody would let me sleep. I was really thirsty, but they wouldn't let me drink because water makes you bleed more. Hearing gunshots, Ahmed's father Khaled called his son, only to receive the news that every parent dreads. This person answering wasn't my son. I said, "Who are you?" "This is the mobile of my son, Ahmed. What's he doing with you?" He said, "Ahmed was shot, and he's not doing so well. He's hemorrhaging a huge amount." As he desperately raced to reach his son, Khaled came face to face with the carnage inflicted by security forces on unarmed demonstrators. I saw a lot of dead bodies on the ground. One was shot here. The top was like a bowl hanging from the skin down the back of his head.
Khalid managed to get Ahmed to a hospital, only to be told that doctors needed clearance from security forces to perform a life-saving operation.
I was forced to lie and say that I was walking in the street with my son. They said, "Was your son in the demonstration?" I said, "No, he wasn't in the demonstration. We were walking in the street together, bringing home breakfast. We were on the way home when a bullet hit my son. He got shot, and we don't know where it came from or who it was that shot him."
As Khaled tried to save his son's life, Ahmed's mother hid in the hospital basement. She could only wait and watch her son's agony. He said, "Mama, it hurts. Mama, tell them that it hurts." I said, "I can't, sweetheart, hush." I said like this, "Hush, we can't. The security might be outside. Hush, sweetheart, so they don't hear us." He said, "Mama, knock on the door for me." I said, "I'm afraid that I'll see security outside, that they'll see us, that they'll know we're here." We sat like that for 2 hours. Ahmed survived, but he has been left with a grisly reminder of his ordeal, which he considers a badge of honor.
Carb from hip and almost to knee, you can say. And I'm proud to have this carb from my country.
But he is luckier than others. According to the United Nations, an estimated 5,000 Syrians have been killed since the uprising began in March. A UN report accuses government officials and security forces of crimes against humanity during their crackdown on protesters.
Torture, sexual violence, and ill treatment were inflicted on civilians suspected of sympathy with the protests. The gruesome and extreme nature of torture methods that we describe in the report were used by security forces and in numerous cases resulted in death.
The Syrian government denies these allegations, claiming they are the misleading intrusion by Western powers.
Despite the fact that the draft resolution was basically presented by 3 European states, however, it's no secret that the United States is the main insightful party, the main mind behind the political campaign against my country.
Fearing for his safety, Ahmed's parents had him snuck through the Turkish border. He then flew to the U.S. to live with relatives in Brooklyn. Today, the family has settled in Bay Ridge and are currently seeking asylum. Ahmed says he wants to finish his studies and build a life in America. But like Syria, his life is in limbo.
The meaning of wait is so hard. You don't know when it's gonna respond for the asylum. And every day I pass here and live here, it's hard. Especially I don't have a social work permit or a social number and bank account. It's difficult here.
Since the uprising began, Syria has suffered severe isolation from the international community. It was suspended from the Arab League and faces sanctions from the United States and the European Union. But for Ahmed and members of the Syrian diaspora in New York, the condemnations ring hollow. They believe that a no-fly zone is the only solution to end the violence. Fehmi Karala is president of the Syria First Coalition, which has been protesting against the regime since the uprising began.
We hear everybody, like the French, Mr. Juppé, like Hillary Clinton, like Mr. Obama, and everybody saying that he lost his legitimacy. But what after that? He's got no legitimacy, but he's still killing us. We've got to have a solution. We have to come to an end.
But according to journalist Mohammed Bazi, a no-fly zone would have little impact, since the Syrian government is not using planes in their campaign.
Certainly, you can have an intervention where NATO or Western aircrafts could target troops that way, but that's not really a no-fly zone at that point. At that point, it's a much wider intervention.
And it's an intervention that could have the exact opposite impact.
In many ways, that plays into the hands of the regime. So as this talk gets more and more widespread, the regime uses it to say, look, we've been saying for months that it's Israel, it's the US, it's outsiders instigating this, and here's proof of it.
While Syria's future remains uncertain, Ahmed is determined to continue speaking out against the regime that tried to silence him.
I wish all of that it ends soon, because I want to the Bashar go to jail, or die like Gaddafi. I want to end this all the protesting, all this. I wanted the freedom soon, now.
For 219 West, I'm Rachel Janishvili.
My name's Reggie. Just recently, my wife and I took in her sister's children. And we already had 4, so I went from becoming a family man to a man with a bigger family. Now, you can't eat love, so I don't know how I'm gonna feed them tonight. How was that, Rich?
I think I look more like Denzel.
That's cold, man.
Play a role in ending hunger. Visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank.
As world leaders continued debating Palestinian statehood, 3 Israelis living and working in New York conducted their own debate on what Palestinian recognition would mean. While they all agree a peaceful solution must be reached, not everyone agrees on how to get there. 26-year-old musician Elad Gellert, originally from Jerusalem, has fond memories growing up in Israel around Palestinian friends.
Growing up in this place, I don't know, as a child, it was amazing, I think. It was really nice, and I have a lot of friends. And we used to have even Palestinians in our school. They don't have the same rights. That's another problem in Israel. But as I could see it, it was equal.
Yaron Samid, a New York-based tech entrepreneur born in Haifa, also remembers harmonious relations with Arabs when he was growing up. But he says things have changed.
It's unfortunate, because I feel a kind of natural closeness to them, but no longer can we mix.
For Israeli scholar Henriette Dahan, being Jewish with family roots in largely Arab Morocco has shaped her perspective. Shortly after she served in the Israeli army during the 1967 war against Israel's Arab neighbors, Dahan started to feel conflicted.
Ideologically and politically, I was very young and very much, today I would call it poisoned by nationalism. I believed that Israel is right and the Arabs are wrong, and everything was in white and black.
So when Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas applied for statehood recognition at the UN last September, these 3 Israeli expats had very different views on what a 2-state solution would mean for their homeland.
Because everything is so stuck, just doing anything would be the right thing to do. And I thought it will start to generate, I mean, even if it's not accepted by United States, even if it's not, at least it made the commotion to remind us that there is something that is very much stuck and has to be moved.
I just think it's not realistic. It's not realistic that they will take one step without Israel. Without a peace agreement, there is no peace. There is no 2 countries. You can't have 2 countries like that. It's not something reasonable.
As the CEO of an internet company, Samid returns once a month to Tel Aviv. He says he feels badly for the poor living conditions Palestinians find themselves in. He says many Israelis support a Palestinian state if it means less violence.
I think it's a general Israeli feeling that we don't want them to be suffering, because the more that they suffer, the more they have hatred towards us as the one who is oppressing them and causing them to be in that case. So we want them to have their own state.
Still, fear of violence seems to have shaped Gellert's political views as he described what it might be like going into a Palestinian city.
I might be kidnapped, I might be lynched, I might be killed. I can't say everything for sure, but those are incidents that happened in the past in Ramallah.
As for Dahan, learning more about Israeli history and her own roots helped shape her viewpoint.
Little by little, I started to become critical, learning and going, of course, to the university, reading stuff. I think I am at a point where I think Israel is too militaristic, unjustifiably, it can be much less, educates to too much nationalism because its lack of confidence of its existence.
In the almost 50 years since the 1967 war, efforts to reach a peace agreement have failed so far. Listening to Henriette Dahan, Yaron Samid, and Elad Gellert, you understand why that is so. Despite a great desire for peace, any agreement continues to be a goal that seems just out of reach. For 219 West, I'm Alva French.
You realize that 49 million Americans struggle with hunger? That's 1 out of every 6 Americans. These people are around us every day. They're our friends, they're our coworkers, their kids go to school with our kids. Sometimes we're not even aware that they're struggling. This problem is closer than you think. But so is the solution.
Play a role in ending hunger. Visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank.
40 years ago, artist Donald Judd packed up his successful life in New York and moved his work and family to a small town in the remote desert of West Texas. That town was Marfa. In recent years, it has become a mecca for artists following in his footsteps. I went to Texas to see an unusual addition to this curious artistic town.
People slam on their brakes and stop because they couldn't believe what they're seeing.
I mean, it truly is, you know, outer space landing, you know, in their backyard.
In the middle of the West Texan desert, 20 miles from the Mexican border, a glow radiates along Highway 90. Not for security, refreshments, or a sign of alien life. This is Prada, where $500 silk stilettos tempt the moths and mosquitoes.
It is a landscape where that kind of store is what you absolutely don't need.
But it is not meant to be a store. The doors are locked. There is only 1 foot of every pair of shoes. This is a work of art.
Art touches some kind of a button. It's emotional connection, it's a visceral connection, it's an intellectual connection.
Prada Marfa's elegant European facade may seem in stark contrast to the barren West Texas desert, but that's the point.
The whole idea is to see how does such a store look when it's taken out of its normal environment, when it's suddenly not in the high street of Milano or in London or Paris or New York.
New York's downtown art scene was where the idea was born a decade ago. Designer stores began to move in. It was a sign that the art and fashion worlds were converging.
The Guggenheim Museum, for instance, had a space down in Soho, but that was taken over by Prada, and for a few years they had these signs up in their big storefront windows saying "Opening soon, Prada."
Opening soon, Prada became an exhibit at a New York gallery in Chelsea.
And Prada at that time was probably the most hip brand among art lovers. They would all dress up in Prada, they would go to a biennial and they would not speak about the art, they would speak about, oh, you have the new shoes, this and this and that.
It was a joke, but so believable the gallery's business suffered.
People would call up the gallery and say, oh, I'm so sorry that you're going out of business, Tanya, but who's designing the new store and how exciting.
That led to the quirky idea of turning a mirror on the vanity of the art world. But would the art world laugh? That led to the biggest joke of all.
And the idea was to put this sculpture, this pseudo-Prada store in the middle of the desert.
The work was a mixture of poignant ideas. Wry comments about art and society, wealth and value, class, art, elegance and crudeness.
It's that kind of dichotomy between fantasy and reality and then dream kind of thing.
Image of the Wild West landscape has been used and reused and abused in so many films and commercial that we cannot see it in the same way anyway.
You know, Prada, what that represents, and it juxtaposed into the austerity and the nothingness out here, that's a pretty powerful statement. I mean, the idea is powerful.
Prada Marfa was built from first site visit to completion in just over a year. Underneath this white paint, the wall is made from traditional adobe brick, which is constructed from the natural organic dirt mixed with water and formed into 12 by 16-inch bricks. Its construction was not the first strange box that had appeared on the landscape. It echoes the work of another artist, Donald Judd, whose legacy haunts the area. His stark minimalism paved the way for Prada Marfa, setting up the twist that would come almost 40 years later, with the ironic joke that Prada Marfa is today. Clearly the joke wasn't funny to everyone. Only days after the opening, the vandals struck.
And they took a chain and popped the door, all the glass fell inside. They entered and took all the purses and all but 6 of the shoes.
Gunshots broke windows. Graffiti covered the walls. Shoes were strewn nearby. Clearly the art had touched a nerve.
I mean, you could sell those shoes and those bags for probably the equivalent of an entire salary or more of somebody living in that area. You know, so for them, it was like low-hanging fruit, almost impossible for anybody to resist.
Strangely, though, the vandalism also signaled a success, as Prada Marfa had provoked a passionate reaction.
An uproar often, you know. It creates a completely different dialogue with the general population that maybe normally don't make it to a museum or a gallery and feel alienated in that world.
So a new question arose. Was the vandalism actually part of the artwork?
Prada's hype, the show's hype. You know, a Prada store Prada is marketing and haute couture, but that's all about, you know, making a splash. So I'm not so sure that that wasn't part of the greater plan at first.
People were congratulating us on the stunt. We know it was on purpose, right?
People really thought we did it the first time, like gagging for attention, like we want to have some scandal around it.
And you know, there's times, yeah, where I wanted to throw some dynamite in there. You know what I mean?
Well, the culprit has not been found, but the myth and mystery has become part of the art.
The stories become real over time. I think what is happening here, what we see eventually, the myth of Marfa is going to become Marfa's reality in time.
So Prada Marfa's legacy is more than visual. It tricks the eyes. It invites us to think, to question and to reach. If only for a passing moment. That's it for this month's edition of 219 West from the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. We'll be back next month with more stories from the 5 boroughs. From all of us here, I'm Jennifer Hamblett. Thank you for watching.